You see these portfolio flows. You see that many secondary European financial markets, though, are losing ground. London will probably maintain its position, but Paris, Frankfurt, Zurich, other ones are losing their position. These are the flows that you see again. If you turn to energy, good news, bad news story. Obviously, Europe very dependent on foreign sources of energy, and that is going to increase, not decrease. And it has, particularly in traditional energy sources, it has to figure out how it's going to deal with this dependency. On the other hand, it is a leader in energy efficiency. It uses EU companies use only about half as much energy per unit of output as American companies, twice as efficient, and better than the Japanese, which they pride themselves on their energy efficiency. So Europe is not in a bad position to lead in this area. And ultimately, I would argue our biggest challenge, the biggest idea that we face is in a world of 7 billion people in which everyone's basing their growth on intensive and extensive uses of energy. This doesn't work. This is not a sustainable proposition for the world, the model we have at the moment. You have to break at some point the link between production of wealth and consumption of resources. That is really the ultimate challenge for a globalized world. And that's not something we're going to solve tomorrow, but it's something we have to solve. And the EU, frankly, is not in a bad position to take leadership in that area. I do some charts, which I won't go into in detail here, on some of the renewables. They're not significant in terms of overall economic impact yet, but of course that's where you develop. So I'm going to just skip through those. You have those maps in here. Here's the biofueled one, just to dwell on that for a second. That's the one that kind of stands out. The story there is, Brazil, that's all Brazil. Brazil and the United States, ethanol producers, U.S. corn ethanol, Brazil sugar cane, versus the EU, which is biodiesel. And which form of biofuels actually, prevails, or how do you develop both at the same time? And because it's agriculture, there are a lot of barriers to this trade. That Brazil arrow would be multiple times bigger if there weren't so many EU barriers to it. The Brazilians would be importing, I think, much more. And of course, on the other hand, there are a lot of subsidies to producers. And so that's also a problem. So I think part of the Doha round deals with this, and it's a big issue for the future. The weakness, I think, the EU really critically has to face is people. This is absolutely the Achilles heel, and it's quite shocking almost. It's an aging, shrinking population, net importer of labor. It's going to it already is affecting EU growth possibilities. It's exacerbating the gaps in labor demand and supply. Despite the commitment to free movement of labor, it's still fragmented. Europe simply would have to double its immigration rates to keep its population decline from continuing. It would have to triple it to maintain the sizes of working population as it is now. It would have to quintuple it 5 times to maintain the relationship of workers to elderly that it has today. This is a stunning kind of challenge for Europe, and it is failing at meeting that challenge. It's still the largest destination for migrants in the world. Europeans take in more migrants than anybody, but they're not skilled. Europe is the magnet for the unskilled. 85% unskilled labor in the world floating around comes to the EU. Only 5% the United States. This is legal, I should add. 55% of the skilled labor comes to the United States and only 5% to the EU. I think that bears some reflection and is something Europe is going to have to think about. You see the migrant flows. You also see where Europeans, when they decide to leave Europe, where they go. Those are outflows of Europeans to the rest of the world. The Australian ambassador is here. He's getting a lot of high talent from Europe. The last point is about ideas and innovation. Europe is a knowledge economy. Continuing innovation is going to be essential to Europe, and it has to continue. It's an overall phenomenon. In the 1950s in manufacturing, traditional manufacturing, the knowledge piece of manufacturing is only about 20%. Today it's about 75%. That was really shocking, apparently. All right, that's right. So maintaining your innovation links are important because innovation today is mainly international and collaborative. You want to connect now and tap ideas elsewhere because companies find that extra slice of knowledge, it turns into an extra slice of profit. So companies are seeking value added, not just cheap labor when they invest. And that's why it's so important, FDI is so important to Europe. And he said, again, you see this interconnection. U.S. companies, almost 3/4 of all foreign R&D in the EU, and vice versa the same for the United States. When you look at the EU, it's a diverse picture. You have world leaders, and you have a lot of laggards. And the EU is in risk of getting squeezed between world-class competitors, innovators, U.S. and Japan, and the rising innovators that are now competing at or even better than some EU member states. So the EU, again, strong position, but it is at risk of losing that position and being eclipsed by others because it has failed to invest in the types of innovation it needs. This shows you the expenditures of different countries kind of on a line there. In terms of the circles are mainly the absolute size of investment, public and private. The chart in the book explains that a bit more. So to come to the conclusion, again, the point, the reset is underway, but it's not here yet. A lot of strengths that Europeans have, which they could utilize to reposition themselves if they use their time. 2020 is not a bureaucratic exercise. 2020 is the closing window for the EU to reposition itself in the global economy. It needs to, of course, get the recovery right, but it has to boost its productivity. McKinsey would argue that the lack of services productivity in Europe accounts for half of the difference between the US and EU in terms of overall productivity. There are many things that the EU could be doing better in terms of boosting its productivity, and because of its aging, shrinking human potential, it has to do that. It's really quite critical. The single market is the bedrock of the EU, and it is its foundation in a world of pan-continental economies. If it can do simply what it's doing in terms of a single market, a real single market, that would have a big boost for Europe and position it well. I mentioned the sleeping giant of services is just very clear, far and away, an untapped strength for Europe. One has not been awakened by European leaders. I mentioned the link between wealth production and resource consumption. That is the big idea out there. It has to happen at some point, or this is not a sustainable proposition, globalization. And the EU is well positioned, but it has to focus. Innovation, I mentioned. Power of the people is to think about a European talent strategy. How do you attract and integrate high-skilled workers from abroad? How do you do skills training for indigenous workers? How do you improve free movement of labor? You have to equip your people, especially shrinking population, with this. They simply have to have more resources to do that. And the last point is back to the connectedness. You have to connect to compete in today's world. And the EU is relatively well positioned to continue to do that. In politics, the first rule of politics, don't forget your base. I would say maybe not a bad rule for economics either. The EU's base is its own single market. It needs to make that real. The next geo-economic base for the EU is wider Europe. Everything you saw, the secondary theme was wider Europe, going up in importance for Europe. That whole band of countries on Europe's periphery is a key source of growth for the EU for the future, if the EU would understand it that way, rather than the image of the Polish plumber or the Turkish construction worker. The extended geoeconomic base is North America. There's just no doubt about it. And if you could truly create an open transatlantic marketplace, reducing lots of the barriers, not just trade, but more of the non-tariff barriers, you could unleash a lot of potential just in the existing key market of the North Atlantic space. But that will not be enough. You have to now leverage, the EU has to leverage growth, human talent, and innovation in the rest of the world. It's all moving at a fast pace. If it can do that while maintaining its core and making that real, I think it has a chance to be well positioned. The new economy is not necessarily a worse one for Europe, depending on how the EU operates. So thank you for your time. We appreciate it. We'll have a discussion.